isn't this something that Marshall Salins at some point wrote about, where he said that when initially we looked at hunter-gatherer tribes and stuff like that, we said they were very simple, like you just described. But actually, if you take into account this other stuff, they become much more complicated again, because there's this invisible dimension that makes what, in a kind of materialist way, it's a very simple kind of, these are very simple societies, but then they become layered with much more complicated and interesting things because they've got this other domain that we don't attend to. I think it was
Well, I'm sure he did. I've forgotten. Yeah. He said it, but many anthropologists say that. I mean, if you read the monographs, Marilyn Strathern, or monographs on, or if you read Levi-Strauss, who I've been looking at recently, I mean, the cosmologies which he conjures out of the South American Indians are immensely complicated and complex. I mean, it's this difficult use of the word simple and complex. They're complicated, and they have many features and they have many constituents, but in some ways the rules that constitute them are quite simple, but they are very complicated. I mean, just as their kinship systems are both very simplified, as I said, but also very complex. I mean, there's a really nice story I've heard, I think, from the person who set out to try and solve the problem. There was a telegram sent by a group of Australian Aborigines to the Royal Anthropological Institute saying we have an 8-section, 4-section kinship system here in our tribe. It's immensely complicated, and it's got so complicated that no one in our tribe can understand it anymore. Could you send an anthropologist from the... So they sent my friend John Barnes, who went and studied as a mathematician, and he more or less sorted it out. But it was a really difficult mathematical problem to sort out their kinship system. And that's true of their belief systems. The Levi-Strauss on the savage mind, the Pensée sauvage, shows this immense proliferation of alternative worlds. So if you put a 17th century English Puritan and his mind against, say, some Navajo Indian or whatever, the mind of the Indian would be filled with much more complex structures in its supernatural entities. I mean, the Puritan would just have God and me. These people would have a wealth of different ideas and so on. So you're right. I mean, it's a truism.
Was Mao trying to get rid of all this stuff as well?
Yes. You see, what he did when I realized keep things as simple as possible, and that was how China had survived. What he then saw was that in some ways they had lost some of the simplicity. Another thing I've learned from Huck particularly is the tragedy of the Qing conquests, because what Huck shows is that up to the Sung and to a certain extent the Ming, i.e. up to the middle of the 17th century, China was this very creative, productive, successful society, leading the world in almost every sphere. And you had the Sung Renaissance and so on. Then you get an alien Manchu ruling class imposed on China. Now, as with all invasions of China, they didn't wipe away China. They were absorbed into it, but they weren't properly absorbed, as he shows. He has some brilliant passages on how, in order to run, basically they were like the British, or like colonialists. They were an alien colonial civilization who spoke a different language, had different hairstyles, different traditions, but there were only about 100,000 of them. So they were deeply suspicious and worried about insurrections of the majority Han. And they purposely made the political system work less and less well. For example, they brought in something which destroyed the old ruling system, much of it, by moving the mandarins around every 3 years. Now, this was, many civilizations do this to stop, people becoming corrupted. The Romans did it, I think, and the British may have done it. But the Manchus did it because they didn't want, all the administrators tended to be Han, and they didn't want them to form a power base. So after 3 years, they were moved to the other end of China. Now this meant that the previous system, which had worked extremely well because they understood the place they were in, they began to represent it, they had a long-term vision of it, they wanted to improve it, and so on and so on and so on. All the benefits of being part of that world to which they were administrators were lost. They became short-term, they became only there to get as much profit as they could while they were there because they weren't paid much. So they became the enemies of the people rather than the friends of the people. And the Mandarins he's constantly dealing with on his trip through China he says, their tragedy and problem is that they can't be good administrators because of this new system that they've introduced. So what he found was a combination of that, a combination of a huge population explosion. The Qing, because they kept peace on the whole, the population went up 5-6-fold from 50 million to 300 million up to the middle of the 19th century. So you've got a real economic disaster facing the Chinese, you've got political disaster facing, and then you've got the West coming in and destabilizing. So by the time Chairman Mao arrives, and you've had a long period of the warlord period, and then the tragedy of the Japanese invasion and the Second World War and the Civil War. What is Mao to do? I mean, he knows, he's a poet, he reads, he's an admirer of Confucius in many ways, but he sees a really stricken China, and he's what to do. And he does the big thing. He says, okay, we won't tinker with this. We'll do what Marx says, which is to start again. We'll get rid of all the things which have built up, which have destroyed Chinese civilization, which is growing class differences, growing private property, false ideologies, Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism and so on, the family system, which clogs up the whole thing. Lay it all flat, start and build again. So that's making things simple, but don't make things simpler, as Einstein said. He tried to take it too far, and then in the great leap forward, we had the disaster, and the Cultural Revolution was a reattempt to make things simpler again. And what Deng Xiaoping did was to go back to the real old China. The hard work had been done by Mao, which is to clear out a lot of undergrowth, and then he could go back to all the strength of the Chinese civilization over the centuries and allow its great ability with money and transactions and all the rest, ingenuity and wonderful craftsmanship and everything else that had been there in China to flourish. So you've got those things